everyone. Good evening. My name is Madeline Jarrett. I am the graduate research assistant here at the Boisi Center for Religion and American Public Life here at Boston College. It is my pleasure to welcome you to our 23rd annual Prophetic Voices lecture entitled, I Have a Theory, But You Have an Ideology. Before the main event, I'd like to offer two housekeeping items. First, this event will be recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. So in light of this, please silence your cell phones. And second, I would like to draw your attention to two exciting upcoming events we're hosting with the Boisi Center. Next week, on Tuesday, October 28th, we will celebrate 25 years of the Boisi Center with an event entitled A Discussion of Religion, Politics, and Culture in the United States in the Last Quarter Century. The event will include two panels, and it will feature the perspectives of leaders of centers related to religion and American public life from across the country. It will take place from 3 to 6:30 p.m. in the Yawkey Center in the Murray Function Room, which is room 426. And on Thursday, November 6th, we will host the second annual Nancy Marzella lecture on women and American Catholicism, entitled, Where Are the Women in the Story of Clergy Abuse? The talk, which will be presented by Susan Reynolds of Emory University, will take place on Thursday, November 6th, like I said, from 5:30 to 7 in Devlin 101. To learn more about these and our other events, please visit our website, bc.edu/Boisi. That's Boisi. And now it is my pleasure to turn over the podium to the director of the Boisi Center, Father Mark Massa.
Thank you, ma'am. Delighted to see all of you. I have the happy task of being the director of the Boisi Center for Religion and American Public Life. It gives me great pleasure this afternoon to introduce to you Jason Blakely as this year's Prophetic Voices lecturer. He joins a long and quite distinguished line of previous speakers, and you can find them on our website. Professor Blakely is a political philosopher and professor of political science at Pepperdine University in California, which has considerably better weather than we do. He is the author of widely noted and reviewed monographs, We Built Reality and Lost in Ideology, which I read because my friend Michael Sean Winters called me up and said, you've got to read this book. So I ordered it. And 2 days later, I read it in 2 days. I thought it was a great book. His essays have appeared in The Atlantic and Harper's Magazine, among other periodicals. He has written on a broad range of topics in contemporary political theory, from ideology and scientific expertise to religion and utopianism. And his writings have been translated into Spanish, Chinese, and Polish. At Pepperdine, Jason teaches an impressive array of courses from ancient Greek political thought and secularity and enchantment to Shakespeare and politics. The way we'll run this evening is Jason will speak to us for 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion with all of you. There'll be Q&A in the second part of this. So please join me in welcoming Professor Jason Blakely.
Thank you. It's good to see you all here, and thank you to the organizers at Boisi, to Mark and to Susan and to Maddie. Very gracious. And BC is actually a place I have a lot of affection for. This is my first time here in 20 years. I used to sneak into BAP's library, believe it or not, which kind of says what kind of an undergraduate I was. But I went to Vassar College, but my then girlfriend, now wife, who just bailed out with my two kids in the back. Those kids weren't interested in ideology or in what Dad had to say, so they left. But my wife was a 2003 alumna, so I used to come here quite a bit. And Mark reminded me that this was the Dust Bowl, this very beautiful building that we're in. It used to be called the Dust Bowl by the undergrads, and I remember it well. So what I wanted to talk about was this kind of crisis that we're facing. And I think of the crisis we're facing, that's one thing everyone agrees on right now in American politics, is we're facing some kind of a crisis. And I think of this crisis as a crisis in part, not wholly, of ideology. And one thing I think that as a sort of jumping off point is just that I think that part of what's happening is that it's very difficult for us to see or be in front of a human presence when it comes to ideology, that ideology has made it difficult to see or perceive the other person as human. And, one example of this, of course, is the recent news, the assassination, right? to assassinate someone is to treat them in some senses as not fully human, and to assassinate them on ideological grounds is an expression of that. But also, you see amongst MAGA influencers, someone like Jack Posobiec, he recently wrote a book called Unhumans, and this thing is a bestseller. It shows how fragmented we are, that I didn't know much of it, but it's a New York Times bestseller. It's called Unhumans, in which he says, the left in the USA is, quote, being consumed by nihilism and is outside the category of humanity itself. It doesn't matter what you call these people, anti-civilization, communist, socialist, cultural Marxists, even progressives. For the purposes of this book, we will call them unhumans. And when they get their way, they will unhuman you too. And so I think that actually, even though that's a sort of disturbing, unsettling expression of that, I actually think a softer version of that is much more widespread. It seems like today the only way to get rid of cannibals is to eat them. In a way. And I think that's kind of the predicament we're all in. And the softer version of this is, I think that people in front of the ideological other, in front of the opponent, there's a kind of voiding or disfigurement of their humanity where they're not fully human. More colloquial way to say this is someone who doesn't have your ideology is either crazy or wicked, but there's like some disfigurement of the human going on so that they're not really fully themselves, such that the boundaries of the human or the recognizably human have become coterminous or overlap perfectly with the boundaries of one's own ideology. Not to say that some people can see the human in the ideological opponent. It's just, it's difficult to see the human in the ideological opponent. For myself, I'm very allergic to this. I have almost like the polar opposite view to this unhumans view. That my view is that actually the reason this is what I'm talking about a bit tonight is, the reason that ideology is so intensely difficult to face is actually because it engages our deepest human factor, our deepest human aspects. And in fact, the deeper you go into ideology, the deeper you find sort of the human. And that's actually what makes it sort of a scandal or difficult to tackle, is that some of our profoundest faculties are at stake when we're talking about ideology. But first, a brief word on the history of ideology, because I think part of what goes on, and hence the title of the talk, I have a theory, you have an ideology, which is sort of a gloss and is supposed to be sort of jokey, but most people studiously avoid describing their own political beliefs as ideologies. And I think the reason for that, actually, a very, very brief genealogy of the word ideology can help us understand why. The person who invented the term ideology, Antoine de Tracy was his name, not very well known except for as having coined this term. He was an Enlightenment rationalist, French, 19th century, early 19th century. Basically, his use of the term ideology, he invented it, and you see it there in the language, was that it was an ideologos. That you could basically hammer out a rationalist, empiricist science of politics in a normative sense, not a science of politics in the modern sense of like a value neutral, but like the right way, the scientifically appropriate way to organize human society, that he would work on this thing called ideology, and that would be it. Now, of course, no one uses the term ideology in that way, because on the heels of that, shortly thereafter, Karl Marx actually gave us the pejorative usage of ideology as false consciousness. And that pejorative use is now almost universal. Ideology is slander. Ideology is like politics in excess, or distorted politics, or crazy politics. I almost want to say on the side is this cultural Marxism that everyone's calling, everyone's using the Marxist term for ideology now, but that's more just a polemical joke on the side. But this use, actually, like false consciousness, right? That one is dominant. But I actually think that in a weird way, the older use is still around. The I have a science or data or just plain common sense or just tradition or customary form of politics that's outside the ideological. So in a weird way, I think the pressure to not use the term ideology anymore actually comes from the residual continuance of ideology as science in our culture. So the pressure to not use the term ideology for ourselves, but use it for our opponents, comes precisely out of the fact that we still hold something like the original use of the term ideology, which is my ideology is just a belief. My politics are a belief system, or they're pragmatic, or maybe even they're enlightenment now, like Steven Pinker says, I guess on the other side of the river here, enlightenment now, not like in a little bit, but now. And so, in a sense, like my politics is the completely enlightened politics. So, In other words, and one last thing I want to say about that is I think that there's a kind of dialectic in our politics where these two play off each other. The more you think of your politics as mere belief system or pragmatics or time immemorial tradition, the less likely you are to grant any status to the other side, because then their belief has to be something like distortion, false consciousness, wicked conniving, or something like this. So what's the positive alternative to this? Because I'm a political philosopher by training. So a lot of what I try to do is, through the history of maybe concepts, try to forge or creatively modify concepts in a way that makes them more helpful. And so the book, Lost in Ideology, part of what it does is, I guess you could call it, conceptual forging. Sounds really cool these days. Some philosophers like to say conceptual forging. So I just thought I'd throw out there that I was conceptually forging these concepts. But I wish I could say I came up with this on my own, but I'm actually standing on the shoulders of giants here. Clifford Geertz, many of you will know from anthropology, extremely famous definition of ideology. His definition is, look, it's not false consciousness. Ideologies are maps. I'm paraphrasing here. They're maps for problematic social reality. They're cognitive maps that give us some vision of how to guide ourselves, take steps within political space, right? So it's a metaphor, but it's a very rich metaphor. Geertz is a hero of mine, but in some ways I sort of take issue with his definition, or I try to improve on it because I think it has some problems, but I basically see myself as working on within his definition. And I try to do that by applying, for those who are interested in these kind of things, the hermeneutics of Charles Taylor and Hans-Georg Gadamer, who another reason to be happy to be at BC is, of course, Gadamer has had some BC connections back when he was alive. Okay, so this is the positive definition that I want to sort of lay out with the time I have left, because I think it has various features to it. So if I say ideologies are like maps, not to like pick a fight a little bit with one of my heroes, Geertz. If I say ideologies are like maps, although I think that's true, I think one problem with this definition is that with a map, the picture's too instrumentalist. Like I hold a map and I carry the map around, and might be entirely fair to Geertz here, and so then the world's over here and I've got the map. And one thing that I try to do in the book is I try to argue that these maps are what I call world making, that the map makes the world. So yes, it's a map, but it's not a map in which there's a very clear line between like word and object, if you like, or maybe better would be between cartography and geography. There's not a very clear line between map and terrain. And in fact, with ideological maps, they're so rich that they can kind of like restructure the entire topography of our social and political life. They can remake the world. Now, back to the Unhumans thing, because I'll make this like a thread through the talk. Humans are world makers. You could give a theological gloss on this. Imago Dei, God made the world, the Michelangelo, and then there's Adam across from him. We're world makers. But I think it's actually, if the theology thing is not a premise you share, I think the philosophical premise is that we're interpretive animals, right? Which is a thesis that comes out of like phenomenology and hermeneutics, but we're interpretive creatures, meaning we're meaning-making creatures. We make meanings and then we dwell in the meanings. Like even this hall, for instance, has a set of meanings to it, the way we're sitting. You know, if I had shown up in like a duck suit, people would be like, LA professors, you can't invite these people. No, but you think something had gone wrong with the real theater of the politics. And in fact, there's an ideological ritual going on in this hall right now. Probably has some features of it that are liberal. They're kind of precognitive, but like, I'll respect your rights. I won't take your stuff. I won't, I won't get too much in your space, or whatever the sort of codification. So you see my point that the map makes the world. And in fact, the way we dress, I just saw a piece in the paper on the new right and the way it dresses. Like, and we all know, like there was some turn there where American flags went from being red, white, and blue to black. Well, what does that signify? I mean, it can feel from the outside a little more menacing, or like kind of like scary, almost like what the flag is black, right? Like, why is the flag black? But in any case, my point being here that ideology is world making in a way that even like rituals of dress or fashion, right, can connote or communicate something about them. This world making aspect, I think, is part of why ideology is so intense, because part of what's happened in the United States is we share less and less of a world. And part of the reason that the other ideological other seem so other is because they come from an entirely different cultural world. In fact, we're in some ways more comfortable with a foreigner now, maybe not, depends on your idea, than we are with the ideological other. Some ideologies are no more comfortable with the foreigner than with the American, who depends which foreigner you pick. Is the foreigner from Russia? Are they from Brazil or from Sweden? But then they are with the American who's from a culture they don't recognize anymore. That's from a world that they don't recognize anymore. One other thing I want to say about this world making thing. I think that Gertz's definition risks sounding like politics is just about ideas. And that is not my view. My view is that politics includes and englobes, ideology englobes materiality. So my son, who was just in here, but he left, he couldn't give you monetary theory. He's 8, but he's very keen on the allowance that he just got. So he's participating in some set of rituals by which he gets these little tokens and he can maybe buy some Legos, which he loves. And so, there's a material, now all of that to me, that's more ideology. Now, can Sebastian, my son, give an account ideationally of the ideology? No, but is it still expressive in ideology? Yes. So when I say it's world making, what I mean is in some sense, materiality in human life has a kind of text aspect to it, and ideologies are expressive in our materiality. So I say this might be my a hobby horse, but someone wrote a review of the book. It was generally a nice review, but it was in common because Blakely doesn't understand power. But to me, power is already expressive of meanings. Okay, so power is inside of an ideological regime and ideological culture. Yes, power, violence is done, but violence always has meaning for humans. When we do violence in a way that's different than wolves, in that we express it in some way. It can be scary. It can be I can't see your face. Why are you doing that without any face? Could I at least see your face? Or it can be, sorry, you're going to the gulag until you finally understand, proper right thinking, or so there are different forms by which violence can take, is my point. I even think war itself is probably inside of culture and ideology in a weird way for humans. That's the only way we can tell who's on which side, in some ways. Last thing I'll say about this, by the way, though, is it gives us a problem. Because ideologies are world making, I think this is why we get in these circles where even the empirical facts seem to confirm to us our ideology. So, for instance, it can just seem intuitive or common sense that any decent human being, because after all, every decent human being I know knows that X is the proper political position or Y is the proper political position. Well, within a cultural milieu, intuition, what's common sense in Thomas Paine's famous line, can appear a certain way. And by the way, for those of you who have your feet in various milieus, which is often the case at a Catholic university, you know that you can switch milieus and suddenly the intuitions all point in a different direction. So you're dealing with people for whom it's almost automatic that X is obviously wrong, and you can just walk over to the other world where X is obviously right or something like this. So anyway, the whole silos thing. And I might say an aside here, one of the figures I deal with a lot, I love him as a writer, is Jorge Luis Borges. And in his very famous short story, you'd be familiar with it, he's got this short story on the rigor in science where he says, it's a fiction, but he imagines a far off people that builds an empire, a map that's the size of the empire. And then they try to unroll the map over the whole empire. Classic Borges, beautiful story. I just grabbed that, I plundered it as a story for what goes on with ideology world-making features. It's almost like our world always arrives one step before us, so we don't have contact with other worlds because our world is always there. It precedes us. We get there, our intuitions are locked in, our culture is locked in, and we don't actually have an encounter with the other. And it starts to seem like the other doesn't even share a world. They're almost like a flat earther or something. They're completely crazy. They're not human. Okay, second point. Let me look at my time here. Second point. Humans are ceaselessly culturally creative and interpretive. So part of what we do with these ideologies is that we're always changing them. And some of these changes have a lot of resonance and they almost become standard to an ideology. Maybe a political philosopher does something like that sometimes. They participate in ideological tradition, they come up with some new formulation of it, and it has a lot of influence. But I think everyone's always doing it. The symbols that we wear. What does it betoken to wear? I'll just take an example because it's been so powerful culturally, a red hat. Tell me you haven't squinted a little more at a red hat. I don't care where you're coming from to see what the red hat now says. That's a red baseball cap. I just want to see. Now, who innovated with the culture there? My point here is humans are always innovating with the kind of cultural symbols and what they connote or what they betoken. And so what I call this in the book is hybridity or fusionism. I think ideologies are liquid. I think one of the reasons we're lost in ideologies, we don't realize it's world making, and so we're lost inside the map. We mistake map for terrain, right? That was the last. But another reason we're lost is because we don't think of them as cultural. We don't think of ideologies as cultural. We think of them almost like hard objects that have very fixed boundaries. And so even though we're very good readers of like music and food, we're terrible readers of ideology as cultural. If I tell you in Peru, there's chifa. Chifa is like a mixture of Chinese and Peruvian food. It's fusion. Like we all know there are all these fusion foods, right? I tell you that, you have no problem. You don't go up to the chifa and say, but is it really Peruvian or is it really Chinese? No, it's a hybrid. It's both. If I tell you there's a band and it mixed hip hop and like heavy metal or something like this, you're like, okay, right. I've heard of Rage Against the Machine. I don't listen to it while I work out, but I understand you do, or my son or daughter do. You understand, and you don't have to say this is hip hop, this is heavy metal. I think with ideology, we constantly are trying to categorize and reduce the ideology to a particular category, if you see what I'm saying. So I think we're very bad with hybridity and fusionism. And I wrote down a few examples here because I think we're really, really bad interpreters. And again, this might be my hobby horse. So this is like Jason reads the paper or something and gets annoyed. But, like go back to something rather dark, but like the Charlie Kirk shooting, right? The identity of the alleged shooter right now and what his ideology was. I read Elon Musk in response, when they found the shooter, he said, the left is the party of murder. I saw some people on left saying the shooter is really a right-wing groyper, which is a kind of neo-Nazi subculture in the United States. What I think tripped people up is this issue of hybridity or fusionism. So the dominant left in the United States it's one of the inheritance, this is just descriptive claim here, it's one of the inheritances of the 1960s that it's in favor of disarmament. The disarmament, and so it's against the Second Amendment. It tends to want to disarm, it's a safer society, et cetera, et cetera. You could go through the argument. We tend to associate sort of like muscular expressions of the right to bear arms with the right. It's Republican inheritance. It goes back to Machiavelli or whatever, however you want to describe that case. What confuses us is you get someone who's basically hybridized. One thing I would want to say to Elon Musk, if he cared to listen, would be the left can't be both the party that wants to abolish the Second Amendment and the party of murder. It's got to be one, just like pick one. Or better yet, realize that hybridity and fusionism means that there are these multiplicities of ideology. That's actually where I'd want to go, is that, okay, so you can have someone who puts these two together. They put together sort of like NRA gun culture with certain causes of the left, right, of the liberal left. And I think that people were very clunky at interpreting, and this is just one example recently that is supposed to make your heart beat a little faster because who wants to talk about this, right? But it's what we're living. I actually think we have cases like that all the time. And I actually think hybridity and fusionism is the order of the day. I think actually if you look at yourself and take stock, you probably have some hybridity and fusionism in your ideology. There are a few people walking around, they're probably just professional philosophers who have like every single belief. It just like rolls out, like John Rawls, like everything fits, no contradictions, thank you. But most people have hybridity and fusionism in part because they're drawing on different things culturally, different places they've been, different things they find resonant, different moral calls that they sort of have. And that this is always going on. We're always going through an iterative process, by the way. So it's like, if and when Marxism reappears, it won't reappear in the same way. If and when fascism reappears, it won't appear in the same way. You can fuse things. You can fuse neoliberal boss culture with fascism. You can do that. Just like you can make chifa, you can fuse things together. You can have hybridity. You can have liquidness and ideology. And I think we're lost. Our heads are spinning because we don't lavish this kind of interpretive attention on ideologies. Whenever we see an ideology, we try to just do something very simple, which is almost like a litmus test. By the way, one of the pressures for that, I think, comes out of polarization. It's like the famous song about which side are you on, right? Like Bob Dylan says in Desolation Row, everybody's shouting, which side are you on? And we live in an age like that. And so there's pressure to almost like hide the fusionism or the hybridity in some senses. Third point. So by the way, that's our creative abilities. And in fact, their ideology is not the thinking of the opponent. The opponent is somewhat like me in some ways. Third, and I actually think this one goes the deepest. I know there's some theologians in the room. I thought that Clifford Geertz's account of maps didn't have, fancy philosophical word, the phenomenology, the what it's like to have an ideology quite right. Phenomenology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the like first person perspective, the what it's like perspective. And I thought that Geertz didn't quite get that. Map makes it sound too cognitively dry. And so I added this concept of ethical magnetism. Now, what I mean by ethical magnetism will sound familiar to you when I start to talk about it. Because what I mean by ethical magnetism is that humans are infinitely demanding animals. So when ideology happens, like the demand is infinite. To me, ideology occurs at the exact same register as religion. In fact, often usurps it or hybridizes with it, because religion is also a culture and can hybridize in various ways. But it occurs at the same register as it. Two figures here from the past. One of the things I think Aristotle was right about is that we're a political animal and that politics is about some telos or vision of the good. I don't say that in the book, but that is part of what's animating philosophically my view of ideology, is that ideology is always someone's vision of a good society. They might not talk about it that way. They might talk about the right versus the good or something like that. But ideology always involves an infinitely demanding, magnetic, most people don't fall in love with maps. Borges fell in love with maps. My mom falls in love with maps. She's got a bunch of maps. But if you say I fell in love with a map, you'd be like, you need some help from a non-AI map. I want to date my map. But I think people fall in love with this map. They really go, we all fall really, really hard for the map. So hard that, as I say in the book, the map is often drawn in red, in blood red. Every single ideology, there's no ideology out there that people haven't made human sacrifices to. There is no ideology out there that people haven't killed in the name of. Now, that's just a descriptive statement. You could think that's good, bad, indifferent, but ideology is a tremendous animator of violence, and even, I'll use a religious word here, of martyrdom. In fact, I think it's easier for modern people to imagine an ideological martyr than a religious martyr. And then I know the follow up on that is, no, but I die for Christianity when I die for the United States. To which I just reply, if there's no space between the United States and a religion that's 2,000 years old and global, then maybe the ideology is actually what's driving your conception of the religion and not the other way around. So I think it's very easy to understand how I would die for Germany or how I would die for Australia. It's very hard to understand how I would die for, say, Jesus of Nazareth. Or even if, by the way, it's worth dying for Jesus of Nazareth, if it's a reasonable proposition. I just think the martyr today is the ideological martyr, not the theo-religious martyr, for what it's worth. And that's because of the ethical magnetic thing. One last thing here. Augustine Pascal. You can fit the human heart in your hand, but it's not happy with the whole of reality. I think this is part of what gets us with ideology. What gets us with ideology is not that we're facing unhumans. It's we're facing another who has a heart like me, and it's infinitely demanding. And it's not the same map. It's not the same world. And what's at stake isn't just material stuff. It's meanings. This is my beef with the whole power. Power always has some meanings. Politics for me isn't fundamentally about power. It's about meanings. Which meanings? Lean on Aristotle. Meanings about what a good society is like. A good polis, a good politics. And so when I confront the ideological other, I confront the other as an infinitely demanding heart like mine and has a maybe different map for which they're willing to die for, possibly. And that's an extremely unsettling fact. And it's even more unsettling when your society itself has that kind of gaps in it. So you confront this sort of the foreign, right? The profoundly foreign inside your own society. Now, obviously, for those of you who read Charles Taylor, that is Charles Taylor's hermeneutics of strong evaluation, but applied creatively to ideologies. The stakes, are impossibly high with ideology. Meaning itself can be at stake, right? Meaning itself in the highest sense of the word. This is called the Prophetic lecture, and I really have no business prophesying much of anything, really. But I teach a Shakespeare and politics course, like Mark said, and one of the plays I really like is Richard II. And in Richard II, once Bolingbroke has unseated Richard II, they drag in, it's interesting, Shakespeare has him drag in a cleric, a Catholic cleric, Bishop of Carlisle, who was a loyalist to Richard. He's like, what do you have to say before we send you to jail for the rest of your life or possibly murder you? I think he says, I'm not going to murder you. But and the Bishop of Carlisle gives this prophetic statement to Bolingbroke, the usurping king who's knocked down Richard II. He says, if you crown him, let me prophesy the blood of English shall manure the ground, and future ages groan for this foul act. If you crown him, let me prophesy the blood of the English shall manure the ground, and future ages groan for this foul act. I'm going to play with that and say, when ideology becomes the highest, the ultimate source of meaning in the human heart, I would say with the Bishop of Carlisle that, there will be blood that will manure the ground, basically, that people will die for the ideology. If we let it unseat or be king in our hearts, then it will appear like anyone who hasn't joined the ideology must have something profoundly wrong with them. They must be unhuman in some sense. They must, in some sense, not really share our world. How am I doing on time? 10 minutes. Okay, so last few things here. How do we get critical distance from these maps? Okay, because I have some thoughts on this. One thought on this. Okay, so first of all, we need a better conception. And, I'm an admirer of Wittgenstein, picture held as captive. And I think part of what philosophy can do that's sort of deflationary and not as grand as like Plato's Philosopher King is a picture held as captive, but it can get us out of the picture, the wrong picture. So if we've got a bad picture of ideology, like it's just, I don't have it, you do, then maybe philosophy can do something slightly therapeutic. It's minor. I'm not like very gung-ho about what philosophy can do to solve our problems, but it's something. It can get us unstuck. But I think there's some other things that I wanted to say that this kind of approach can do for us in terms of like getting us out of the thrall of the map. The first is that I think we can get critical distance on our maps through something called immanent critique. Philosophers call it immanent critique, by which you understand a map on its own terms imaginatively, which is what I'm always like trying to do. I feel pain actually in front of my students. I love to teach, but I feel the pain of the ideological other looking at me and thinking, that's not my ideology. I'm always trying to get the what it's like feel, the phenomenological feel of that ideology. In fact, the book, after introducing this kind of conceptual apparatus, then is just a tour of all the ideologies, and it's attempt each chapter for like what it's like to be a liberal, what it's like to be a feminist, what it's like to be a socialist, what it's like to be a nationalist, what it's like to be a fascist, what it's like to be an ecologist. Thomas Nagel has that famous essay, What It's Like to Be a Bat. It's in the philosophy of mind. Like, it's so hard to imagine being a bat because they have sonar and we don't. But I actually think it's probably easier to imagine how to be a bat than for some people to imagine what it's like to be a conservative, or for some people to imagine what it's like to be a liberal. It's like, no, give me the bat. Isn't it Augustine that says the surest sign of original sin is that we'd rather be with a dog than with a foreigner? I think that's Augustine. I think we'd rather be with a bat than with the ideological other. I'd rather be in a room with a bat. Now, one way to get unstuck is this kind of imaginative, I imagine, most undersung faculty in intellectual life, the imagination. I imagine what it's like to be you. So I become conversant in your language. I become conversant in your tradition. I think one of the reasons people don't do this actually is it's like the lady doth protest too much. It's like we're actually scared of the other person's map because we feel its ideological pull. We feel the magnetism. And we sense a possible loss of self in listening too hard to the other one. So it takes a certain amount of strength of character or heart to actually go into the other person's map, not make a cartoon of it. And by the way, I think a totally fair critique of my book would be if someone read a chapter and is like, that's not the ideology. You didn't get the what it's like feel of that political tradition. If we go into that, there is something there even for those who want to be critical, which is this immanent critique thing. One of my students taught me there's this term now, steel manning online, which it's like the opposite of straw man. See, intellectual innovation, like hybridity, creativity and culture. We say straw man, now young people say steel man an argument, like make it steel, don't make it straw. I'm really into steel manning ideologies, like make it as strong as you can. Now, my promise to those who still want to do critique, which I do want to do, is you will make a better critique if you make a critique from inside the ideology. So I often tell my students, like, the Richard Dawkins New Atheist thing. I used to be an atheist. I converted into Catholicism, and I'm totally untroubled by the New Atheists. It's just such a bad, dumb critique that it's like I don't even recognize what they're talking about. But one that makes me sweat is in the Brothers Karamazov, when Ivan says, "Why would God let a child be born, suffer a horrible disease, and die?" See, that's immanent critique. Dostoevsky understood from inside Christianity something that really gets at attention, an all-loving God allowing. I can understand how an adult might need to suffer. I don't understand why a child should have leukemia and die. That's Ivan to his brother Alyosha in the Brothers Karamazov. Immanent critique is a lot more powerful form of cultural and political critique. You are looking for like the actual arguments that put pressure on your ideological opponent. But here's the rub. You're not going to get that unless you go deep into their ideology. Otherwise, it'll just be like Richard Dawkins, critique from the outside that no one recognizes. Oh, you believe in a sky fairy, something like that. We all do the you believe in a sky fairy. We do that to the ideological other. You believe in sky fairies. I don't. Dan Williams, professor at a university in the UK, philosopher, said this recently. He said, "Watching the Charlie Kirk Memorial, I'm struck by how extremely cultural distant I feel from this world. Everything about it feels alien. The aesthetics, symbolism, music, rituals, mythology, gurus, ideas, and norms. It feels like I'm being exposed to the cultural and symbolic universe of a distant tribe." I thought that was incredibly honest, eloquent, healthy statement. I think more of us should reach that moment of, and by the way, he goes on to say, I felt a strange empathy because I realized that I must look really alien to the other one. Immanent critique involves a possible risk or hazard to my own ethical magnetism, to my map. I might be different at the end of the ideological journey or not. Okay, second, more quickly, to get kind of, because I'm not a positive, I'm not a naturalist. I don't think you can just empirically describe ideologies. I think that's a mistake. My view is critical. It's a critical view of ideology. I think you can be objectively critical of any ideology that can't self-narrate as a cultural map. I think whenever someone says my ideology is just science, it's materialist history, or it's a science of free market economics, I think they just don't understand that they're doing culture and world making, but in fact, they're describing it as mere science. So I call this the map terrain error, like confusing cartography for geography. Whatever else ideologies are, like religions, they need to be defended as cultural traditions. And whenever someone says, I've got the scientific version of it, you can know that that version in particular is false. So this ideological critique can do kind of like a negative work of telling us what an ideology is not. Final one, and I will end on this. I think we all have rival sources of meaning in our lives. I talked a bit about that before with hybridity, but I think, and again, to borrow here on Taylor, Charles Taylor's, he calls this cross pressures. I think modern people have different sources of meaning that they feel pressing in on them. And we don't spend enough time with the ethical sources we have, the sources of meaning we have that don't quite fit with the other ones. And by the way, yes, where I'm going with this is religion, unsurprisingly. Yeah, surprise, surprise. The Catholic wants to take this to a religious place. But I actually think even if you're not religious, I think sometimes people really resonate with an artist. I read Ann Coulter really likes the Grateful Dead. And I thought, fascinating. Wow. My hippie uncle, Frank, I love this guy. He loved the Grateful Dead. It does not compute to me that Ann Coulter likes the Grateful Dead. But I think that in some ways, like if there's still some human sympathy there. Like, good for her that she still likes the Grateful Dead. Good. Now, maybe go deeper into that. Like, why do you like the Grateful Dead? And is it, what else is there maybe? So it could be art. It could be some ethical source. But I think, religion, I think the world religions are older than ideology. This is the thought I want to end on. I think the world religions are different sources of meaning. They can get swallowed up by ideology, so you can't see any difference or remainder. It looks like your religion is in a complete one-to-one with the ideology. But of course, the world religions, as we call them, they're all older than the ideological maps. So there's some kind, read the Sermon on the Mount and really try to like craft an ideology out of it. I like Leonard Cohen when he says, I don't pretend to understand the Sermon on the Mount at all. I think that's incredibly humble. Jewish, secular musician saying, the Sermon on the Mount, which I don't pretend to understand at all. I, as a Catholic, when I'm really in front of the Sermon on the Mount, I'm not trying to understand entirely what's being asked of me and the paradoxes. Blessed are those who mourn, blessed are those who are persecuted, etc. One cross pressure that we can recover is religion for a space of the human. Now, I want to say something about this because in some sense, this is like a much bigger conversation, but in some senses, I think religions like Buddhism, the Abrahamic religions, they have a conception of the transcendent of God that's bigger than the political. But that can be hard to see because in every one of them, you can have the reduction of religion to the political. But I think that there's the possibility in religious sources for a space for human encounter with the other one that's not ideological, a sort of hanging on to the person who is the ideological opponent or other, in spite of the fact that they're the ideological other. I do think, though, and by the way, crypto-Augustinianism there, like, that's Augustine again, like that the city of man, the ideologies, the maps, God didn't make those. We made those in history. We made those in the world. Those are worlds we made. We can think they're good, we can think they're bad, but Jesus didn't come down with an ideological program. He didn't know anything about free market economics, or he didn't know to give us the Communist Manifesto or whatever it is. That's not what he did, right? So I think that I don't know when the age of ideologies will be over, but I think that these maps surely will go away someday because they emerged at one point, right? They emerged with early modernity, and surely these maps will go away someday. And I do think it's impossible. This is kind of like, if you like, in a prophetic register. I think if I knew what the end of the age of ideologies was, we'd already be at the end of it. I don't know how to live without an ideology. I have an ideology. I have probably some hybrid of an ideology, right? That I'm always reworking in some way. But I do think that in some senses, the age of ideologies can't go on forever. And we can always keep one foot out if we keep in mind these kind of cross pressures or other sources of meaning. So that is something I wanted to share. Thank you very much for your attention. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me ask the first question. It has been said that Americans are ideologically innocent more than other people. Do you agree with that? Or if you agree or disagree, could you explain how that statement is true or false?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Mark. It's a great question. I have political science friends who they say, you know what, Jason, Americans don't have ideology. The position there from Philip Converse, it's a classic piece of scholarship, is Americans are ideologically innocent. And the way that political scientists prove this is they take surveys and they ask people to, in different ways, reconstruct their ideological beliefs, and they can't do it. They can't put together the thing right. Now, my view of this with the whole world-making aspect is that this is a mistake, that they have the wrong concept of ideology. They're thinking of ideology too intellectualist. Political science, the fighting words, but I think political scientists think of ideology in too intellectualist a register. They think you don't have ideology if you can't reproduce it as like an intellectual system. But I think that's wrong. I think that we're always, like I used the example of money. I think the fact that I said Sebastian can't give monetary theory. I can't give monetary theory. We'd have to get the economists here. I could take a shot at it, guys. But am I innocent of money? No, absolutely not. Right? And I think the mistake here is that we're participating in ideological rituals even when we can't reproduce them. Second thing I'll say just really quickly is I think we have this fascinating analogous historical case to the Reform and Counter-Reform when clerics, and some of them the Jesuits actually, were like tearing their hair out about you couldn't get the believers to like reproduce the creed properly, right? And the ideological innocence thesis holds that basically elites are really ideological, but the mass of Americans aren't. And I think we have an analogous historical case where elites always want you to have like the proper conservative and liberal beliefs, but that doesn't mean the mass of Americans don't have ideology. It just means that they have more hybridity, fusionism. Sometimes that's a source of creativity. Sometimes it's a source of incoherence. And, it doesn't make any philosophical or political sense that you believe these two things, and you could do imminent critique on it. But yeah, I basically think that that's wrong. And it's almost outrageous to me. I mean, it's almost funny that someone would look at the United States today and think, we don't have ideology. I just think that they've got the wrong concept in play. Yeah.
Questions?
Hi, thank you very much for your talk and for your book. It's very interesting and provocative. And I guess I have what's probably going to seem to you a basic question or maybe even a basic challenge. And I guess I still find myself not fully understanding the word ideology and what you mean by it. And then also, I guess the challenge was, would it be better to use another word? And the reason for that is, like, sometimes when I hear you talking about ideology, I hear liberal, conservative, political views, political platforms that we have. Sometimes when you talk about meaning making, I think of a cultural linguistic system, where people know how to operate within the world and have certain values, certain ways of relating, certain social interactions, almost the social imaginary. And sometimes when I think of it, I think of something like, and you mentioned him in the book, but I was surprised he wasn't in there more, something like McIntyre's, living tradition, which has got institutions and practices and virtues, sort of a way of seeing the world. And then, of course, he's got a notion of hybridity when things go back and forth. So I just wonder if you could give me a little bit clearer understanding for me of what counts as ideology. And then I guess the question is, the big challenge to it is it's idea plus logos, right? It is a rationalist system. It is something that people want to write down to the extent you're talking about it, a political platform, a manifesto. Would you be better for your purposes, not in saying we've all got different ideologies and they're fluid and hybrid, but saying the idea of ideology, the term of ideology, is actually pointing us in the wrong direction?
Yeah, those are great. Both of those are great questions. You might need to remind me of the second one. Well, I revere Alistair McIntyre. I wrote my dissertation on him. And my conception of ideology is very similar to his notion of rival traditions. If I wanted to pick a fight with someone who's several stories up from me, I would say that one thing he gets wrong in the sociology of modernity is, it's like Nietzsche versus Aristotle versus the Enlightenment. And my account has way more traditions. I think he just gets sociological reality wrong there. Like, it's not that you have to be in you're either a Nietzschean, for those of you familiar with McIntyre, but conceptually it is very similar, this idea of rival traditions and how they work. So one thought, yes. And to your point, ideologies are cultural traditions. I'd be happy with that term, though I think the term map does more work. And Gertz is a giant in the field, and I'm happy to have inherited and try to apply his metaphor. But you're right that, so as a political philosopher, I think one bad way to conceptually forge is if you make a concept so big that it's vacuous, right? Which I take it to be part of what you're saying here. It's like, is ideology something or is it everything? Is it like every single cultural system out there? And did you want to say something back about that? Because I have a word on that, but I see you nodding, Kathy.
I'm just listening.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, no. So, sorry, what?
No, part of the practice of listening to somebody is nodding.
You should tell that to my undergraduates. Nodding off. No, just kidding. So conceptually, I think I put certain, I don't always like this language, but if it helps, necessary or sufficient conditions on it being called an ideology conceptually. One is, I'm neo-Aristotelian. Ideologies have to be about a vision of the collective good life, right? About politics. So religion might overlap with that. It's true. Religion also has this problem, by the way. Is it something or is it everything? Right. And depending on how you cash out the concept, which was invented in the 19th century, it does. But anyway, religion scholars also wrestle over this issue. Okay. It has to be a vision of the good is one. Another feature of it that I didn't talk about at all, but it's at the beginning of the book, is that ideologies to me come from an age of disenchantment, which gets me to something else that you brought up, which I'll get to. But ideologies to me are from a secular age. What I mean by that is ideologies are formulated against historical imminent time. Newtonian time, the notion that we're in history, we're doing this. The other here, and this is from Taylor's Secular Age, the other here is our ancestors. I love this in Shakespeare, straddled both worlds, where there are signs and wonders when, the king is going to get killed. There are signs and wonders because some of our ancestors believed that the regime was in some way baked into the cosmos. As much as I admire Plato, I even think he has a little bit of that with the whole forms and the regimes always have to be the same. So the way I distinguish them from religion, by the way, one of the ways I distinguish from religion is concerned with some religions are concerned with something like the transcendent or something beyond the political. But another way to distinguish it is ideologies are from an age of disenchantment, an age in which we knowingly or self-consciously mobilize around the maps. And something I say on the chapter in conservatism, which is a little bit of a barb at Burke, is that we all have the style of politics of the French Revolution now. Even conservatives do. Conservatism is mobilized just the way the French revolutionaries did, by which I mean ideas are formulated, pamphlets are made, people are gathered around it. In fact, that's one thing that can go wrong in conservatism, internal to its own tradition, in my view, is that it can become abstract. The tradition's abstract. I don't even have the tradition anymore. I'm just nostalgic for it. But I rally around it just like the Jacobins rallied around the rights of man or something like that. So in any case, this style of politics, I think, comes from an age of disenchantment. Now, you might hear that that's bad, but I think that's where we're at in terms of the social imaginary. It's like, there's no way of doing politics in the naive way anymore, where we just assume that, like the Monty Python skit, some lady in the lake is going to throw us the sword or whatever it is. Even if we try to do that, ideology reproduces itself always. The non-naive position reproduces itself. Whereas I take it that the world religions come from before that, and that there are claims that are made that are enchanted claims about sources, etc. But every one of the ideologies we can source within history itself. Like we can see when the map was made. There was a second thing you said, is there...
Would you be better off using another word because it's so flat and intellectual and doesn't have the broader capaciousness of culture, tradition, commitment, practices, like a McIntyrean tradition?
Yeah, I mean, tradition and culture to me are broader. Like tradition and culture are the broader categories. Like they're cultural traditions of food, art, religion. Ideology is the narrow one. Okay. And I'm very big on self-understanding, and ideology is a term that is used by people. It's usually used to like talk about the other, but everyone thinks everyone else has ideology. Like ideology is ubiquitous. So in that sense, I don't think it's an intellectualist term. I think it's a completely like ground level, ordinary person term. Like they would recognize that more than rival traditions. Like if I said you have rival traditions of political inquiry or something like that, I'm open to correction, but that would be the answer I give right now.
Sure.
Yeah.
Professor Heyer and then Professor Melnick.
Thanks very much for your talk. I had two unrelated questions, if you'll allow. I haven't read the book yet, but I was struck by your brief comment on power, and I also don't remember the Commonweal review of your book. But could you say more about the relationship of power? You said politics is more about meanings than power. Certainly, maybe it's about both, but I'm curious about how power relates to the function of ideology in your argument. And then second, you've given us a lot of examples of the current state of affairs. Given our current state of affairs, can you give us any hopeful examples or practices of the imminent critique that, as you point out, is going to take deep dives? It's going to actually incur risk. Where do you see possibilities for the type of imminent critique to get us out of dueling ideologies?
Yeah, the second one I wish, let me think on for a second, but sorry, what was the first one?
The first one was just to hear more about the function of power,
power.
With respect to ideology.
Yeah. Okay, so that is a massive topic because their entire research programs, extremely brilliant people who tell you politics is about power at the middle, and I'm against that view. One way why I'm against that view is because I think it mistakes that it's possible to have a third-person perspective outside of ideology, and I don't think the social theorist is outside of ideology. And so whenever someone says, I'm just going to give you an analysis of power, I think it's actually expressive of a particular ideological tradition, which is not the same as saying it's false. It's just that I think that when we start saying it's about power, we have to, and it's deployed in different ways, and I'll give you some concrete examples here in a second, but usually what's going on is an attempt at a science of power or an objective description of politics. Like, no, you know what, Jason? Politics is about class conflict and the power, the conflict between classes, right? And what you don't understand is it's not just about meanings. Or I'm trying to think of another example here. No, Jason, what you don't understand is there's this thing called woke capital, and it's trying to disintegrate traditional life, and they've got all the power. All the liberal elites have the power, and they're trying to destroy our life world, right? And it's about power. And so even in that gloss there, you can start to see that I don't think we can specify power separate from ideology. And I think social theorists should identify themselves within cultural traditions when they talk about things. The dream of talking about politics as a pure power, social physics, I think comes out of a set of research programs that, some of my other work deals with, which I call, which other people as well, but call naturalism or positivism, in which we have some third person perspective on the human situation. We're outside the first person perspective, and we can give just like a scientific account of politics. And I think value neutrality in the social sciences is ultimately mission impossible. And I think one of the reasons is kind of coming out here, which is like, if you try to describe power, ideology is actually, you're being naively ideological. There's ideologies in the wings. It's doing the work as to how to do. Another way at that, I'll just say this much more briefly, is I think anthropologically, the human animal, when it does violence or force or whatever we want to call power or establishes a hierarchy, it's always expressive of meanings, like I was saying. And so it's never just like, okay, and I could be corrected here by a biologist or something, but non-cultural biological agents, like you could take a wolf in a time machine and drop it off from like the beginning of the species to the end, no problem. But humans will be totally disoriented by the pecking order, because the pecking order itself is expressive of culture and meanings. And so even when we say, I'm going to do violence to you and it's just going to be raw power, that's usually expressed, that sounds sort of fascist to me. Like, it's just going to be about power, just raw power. What kind of raw power? Well, look at the size of my biceps and look how tight my shirt is and look how I'm strapped with all these weapons. And yes, I like German iconography from the early century, part of the century. And it's like, oh, wait, you don't mean raw power. You mean like raw white power or raw German power or, whatever it is, or that you mean the manosphere, which is not quite the same. I don't mean to totally lump those together, but like, it's never just power. It's always you're anti-feminist. That's what you're expressing. You don't like feminism, right? You see what I'm saying? And I lost the other question. Sorry.
The other question was about where do you find the imminent critique that you raised?
Yeah. I mean, imminent critique has probably worked on me many times over the ages. I'm trying to think of an example in politics. I guess I'll pick on like kind of neoliberal economics. If it's supposed to give you a predictive science of economy, I think you can go into it and then ask, okay, in what ways has this proved fruitful as a predictive research program? That might be one place I'd start. If someone tells me, I've got a science of economics and it tells me that the state is always inefficient and the market is always efficient. I love Margaret Thatcher. She's the Iron Lady. Someplace I might go with them is, what's an example of a prediction? And has it given you clairvoyance in light of recent event? That kind of pressure of, okay, explain to me what your theory of strong prediction is here. Yeah. Like even the all boats rising thing. I mean, like it's galloping inequality. That's just like a factual statement right now. Right. But we did have a lot of policy for several decades that was that supposedly was on the lines of like economistic science, and it was going to distribute. So, but I think you can do this with all the ideologies, by the way. Yeah. Marxism, like why doesn't the revolution arrive? I've got an answer to that, which is the working class is cultural and it's not a scientific thing you can identify separate from cultural regimes. So the working class isn't proto-Marxist. It's not proto anything. It's a culture. Cultures, plural. And so some working class people want to go union. Others want to go nationalists. Others think they're aspiring Thatcherites and Reaganites that are on the way up. So that's another one. It's like, I think that's a big one in Marxism is why doesn't the revolution arrive? And very smart Marxists spend a lot of time trying to figure out why the revolution hasn't arrived. Because Marx was thinking it was London, Paris, right, New York, last century. So.
Thanks, Jason. I have two questions. One is short and whimsical, and the other is longer and a little more serious. My short question is, who doesn't love the Grateful Dead? I mean, I realize that Jerry Garcia is very prominent on my map, and I assume that is true of everyone here.
Yeah. Uncle John's Band is a great song.
My more serious question is about populism, because if you want to say what's the most powerful force and disruptive force in the United States, in Europe today, it'd be populism. So I wonder what you can say about the relationship between populism and ideology in two ways. One is, one of the features of populism is we stand with the people. And when you have people, 50% of the public that doesn't vote for you, maybe they're not the people. So it goes into your dehumanizing aspect, and I think that's an important element there. But on the other hand, populism is promiscuous ideologically. It is all over the map. And it's not just kind of fusion or hybrid, it's changing 1 minute to the other. So I was interested in what you say about the relationship between populism and more hardened ideologies.
That's a great question, because honestly, populism it's confusing. I think for all of us in this line of work, like Shep and us, it's like what exactly is happening here is somewhat mystifying. And for a long time, my take on populism was that it was the technical term would be exogenous, but basically I mean like outside of the self-understandings of the people who. So I thought of it as a slander term. It's like centrist liberal establishment elites don't know what to do with the fact that no one seems to follow their leadership anymore. And so then we'll just call this populist, by which we mean people who are not well enough educated, don't have their ideological ducks in a row, don't seem to believe the right things. So I thought of it almost like as a slander term, like, oh, you're just popular, you don't really understand. But I think it's been owned in people's self-understandings at times. I do think that populism, what I would tend to look for initially is, I think it's maybe not always helpful for getting us at the really thick ethnographic reality on the ground of the different ideologies that are underneath that. Like it seems to cover everything from people who are interested in Bernie Sanders to people who are Tea Party. And all those people are upset at the sort of liberal, and I mean liberal broadly here, of like the left-right Republican Democrat consensus that existed for a lot of my childhood. And then that's what we're seeing is going away or is really shaky right now. But yeah, I mean, I have to be committed sociologically and open to the fact that there could be a novel ideological thing happening that I don't understand here fully. For now, I would still try to narrate it in terms of the major traditions or maps. And I would use some caution when sometimes people just say it to mean like, it's like a slander or shorthand for you don't understand economics because you want a tariff or because you want a social welfare state. It's like, well, that's too quick to me. But yeah, I think it, and obviously has a longer history in people like Machiavelli and things like that. So I think it's unfinished business, and I find it a confusing term. I was initially hostile to it. I'm now sort of open to something new might be happening, but still don't have categories for it and would tend to fall back and re-narrate it on the existing ideologies. Yeah.
Thank you, Jason. So I have a question. I think it returns a bit to the first question from the floor. As I listened to the talk, I was hearing two kinds of ideology. And one was an ideology that seemed instrumental, not something embedded in who you are or something embedded in a cognitive map you're using to navigate the world. You throw out Marx and false consciousness, right? So that's what does Marx get wrong? And you say, well, he doesn't understand culture. So that's true, right? We know that, and he dismisses it. But there's no interest in this framework that I can hear or that I can see. But I heard, but you used the word ideology seemed to be instrumental to interests in some of the examples you raised. So why doesn't the revolution occur? maybe because some workers have higher technical skills and they don't want to be lumped in with manual laborers on an assembly line. They have interest not to unite into one uniform class consciousness and turn over a system in which they're receiving a greater reward. Maybe. Like Musk's snide comment about the Democrats being the party of culture. Is that something that flows from an embedded map? That's just a slogan being slapped on people who have an interest in a current political contest. And that's what I hear through. That's what I'm seeing through some of the examples you're given. And it just strikes me as being very different from Gertz and maps and having a cognitive order to the social and ideological world that you have to navigate as an individual. And so I think this is a variation of the very first question. So I'd like to, when you answered it, that didn't come through. So I would hope that you would indulge me at least and come back to it. And also when we're talking about the maps. Okay.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Well, no, interesting. So, two thoughts there. One is the ethically magnetic nature of maps doesn't mean that certain. So it does. You rightly point out that I'm partly committed to the idea that deep senses of human identity can come out of ideology, like how I dress, like what I think my vocation is, where I think I should take my life, what I think I should sacrifice for. However, there are some people who instrumentalize ideology or can have like a kind of cool relationship to them, or use them for different ends without really believing them. I think the analogy here is to cultural traditions of religion. Like, do you really believe is a question you can ask in ideology, just like in religion. Like, is this person a true believer, or are they just using this as a ladder to climb up? Or a less nefarious version of that, someone I admired a lot, even though I disagreed a lot with him, was Richard Rorty, and he had this idea of a liberal ironist. But the ironist presupposes ethical magnetism on my account. Like, the fact that you can kind of sit coolly at the door of an ideology, just like you'd sit coolly at the door of the church and not fully go in, but you're not leaving. To me, you can only be ironic about something that predominantly has some strong pull or meaning for somebody, so then you can ironize about it. In terms of the interests question, that one's it's in a similar, to me, position as the question about power, which is interests to me, which are often used in economics or in political science to just describe or give a science of society that's third person, to me is still inside a particular ideological tradition. You gave a gloss on it that was sort of Marxist, where you have class interests, right? But usually in the United States, the way you hear it is like a Madisonian. They'll say their interests and different interest groups, and politics is about balancing out interests. But the concept of an interest, and this is in the book, like it emerged historically, as you know, and it emerged historically, particularly around liberalism first, but then a second wave with like socialism and Marxism, around the problem of the interests and the sentiments, that like, how is society going to hold together without the sort of old enchanted views that kept it together? And a very fascinating answer that people like Adam Smith and all sorts of people came up with is you could have a contract and it would be in your interest to be in society. But even when you say unit interest, it'd be a much bigger conversation of this, but just to give you an idea of where I'd go, is like, when we say interest, what we're specifying is some objective claim about your usually economic or political interest. But my point is politics is more capacious than that. So that's already assuming a particular ideological tradition, and people act against their interest all the time. Very confounding. So that at that point we can throw up our hands and say you're irrational or you're whatever, but because meaning is more important to them. It's more important. They don't know what you mean by working class interest. What they know is that they work hard as a mechanic and the USA is going down fast. And I don't know what you mean by interest, but I'm with MAGA, right? And so like, that's a meaning claim to me. The language of interest, I don't see as ideological innocent in that sense. It's already within a particular, now our interest is a huge part of ideology, yes, but not all the traditions have interests. If I can say one last thing here, one thing that's very vexing about fascism as a tradition is that it tends to just explode the notion of interest over and over again, because as Mussolini says, action, not talk. It was one of his favorite sayings. In other words, like every time you try to specify the rational, I'll just bust through that in the name of like the reassertion of the nation, et cetera, such that it looks completely incoherent, but what's actually being exercised is a kind of power. But just to confound your liberal or socialist or whatever notion of interest, I will do something against my interest 5 times a day, just to show you I have the power to not follow interest. The leader, the dear leader, has the power to do nothing that's interested. It's interested sometimes, it's not interested other times. It's irrational from the other map, but it has its own method to its madness from inside the map. It's like, yeah.
Hi, I want to reiterate, thank you so much for this amazing talk. I guess my question was kind of to your point about kind of going inside someone's like framework, I guess, to better understand that ideology. I was wondering, I mean, I'm 23, so I haven't lived kind of in, I guess, places where it hasn't been like this, but if, I guess, in the past it has been easier to kind of do that, do you think, I guess, I feel we're less attached to identity, less attached to space? Social media, I think, might be a big reason. Like, why do you think that might be that we do struggle so much more now, if you take that to be true, than in the past to kind of understand, I guess, where people are coming from simply?
Yeah, and you're saying that in a way the internet has made it harder because what?
I just think, like, you don't have to kind of understand in a sense. You can't, it's much easier to label people like, you know, the opponent. Like, I know where you come from, even though you don't even know who that person is necessarily on social media.
Yeah. It's so internet is really interesting because I think it's both a site where extreme liquidity and hybridization is going on, and you can find yourself in a corner of the internet where you're completely bewildered if you just let yourself be humanly present to it by what the utterances that are being made. Like, to me, it's wild as someone who grew up in the 80s and 90s, the whole thing, like, that video game culture has become auxiliary to different ideological subcultures, you know? So one thing that's going on the internet, I think, is it's a reeling world, Catesby, isn't that said in Richard III? It's a reeling world, I think I quote in the book. But I love that phrase. But we live in a reeling time too, right? It's a reeling world. And it's partly reeling because there's a lot of cultural creativity, and that's not to say the same as good, but like there's a lot of creativity around ideology, and a lot of that's online. Words, language that's used. But at the same time, to what you're saying, I do think this world-making effect happens where, like, if you're in a given milieu and you've got your followers, for instance, or you're you're in the orbit of somebody, everything repeats back at you that this figure, anything they say is reasonable, and everybody outside is treated as a straw man, denounced, name calling, and maybe even in a way that's clever, like you actually understand a little bit, just enough to get the insult off. But I think that it is an effect of, it's a non-topographical case of the map swallows the world and being lost in ideology because you're in a milieu. It's non-topographical, it's on the internet, it's virtualized topography, but like somehow you're in a constellation that's a village where you're protected and buffered from the other, right? So I think that happens myself as well, which is part of why the internet's so unpleasant, by the way. I'm supposedly on X, but Lindsay, who walked out, is always like, sign out of X for the next 3 months, and I'm not on until January, because she's like, you get so grumpy, and part of it is if you brush up against someone else's milieu, in your own milieu, everyone's like, great, wonderful. You get into someone else's milieu, and you're like, you're a complete idiot, horrible human being, scum. It's amazing that anyone, listens to you. And so it's very jarring. And so actually the world making effect gets stronger. It's like, let's keep the other voices out, That's one thought, or those are two thoughts I have, I guess, on that. Yeah.
Hello. Hi.
Former student.
Good to see you. I had him when I was in my master's program at Pepperdine, so I'm delighted to be here. So I have a question that's actually kind of bridging this gentleman's question and then the question here, because I thought your point about imminent critique was really interesting, and it reminded me of, and to say my place on the map, I'm a feminist. I was at a conference in the summer, and there were these two scholars. They looked up their names. So Britt Starr at Trinity and then V. Lawson at San Jose State. They were doing things. Their work is about like entering in these different spaces in social media and then trying to insert in like a different perspective. So Britt Starr was looking at, V. Lawson was looking at the overlap between like trad wife aesthetics and then like all the way on the far like left aesthetics, and then thinking about how could you like where is the algorithm forcing people to go one direction or another? And so my question to you then is, I think you've done, you've given a lot of really kind of tangible examples here, which have been really exciting. And you offered religion is this space that could, kind of, I don't know if fracture the world making isn't the right word, but like an alternative conception of where people could brush up against the other. Where else do you see like potential and hope for there to be these sort of encounters? That's kind of, it's a big question and it might be outside of the scope.
So many years now. No, I took this class, so did Adian. I'm proud of my students at BC, and Adian's at Harvard Divinity, and they both took this class on the other side of the country. So they've like seen this, for a long time. I'm amazed you have appetite for more, but thank you for going. I think there's so many sites, and in a way, I like hesitate to say religion because then people sort of shut down. I do actually think religion is probably the most powerful source against ideology, rightly understood. But art, like I was saying, the city can be. Our cities have been politicized, sort of, unfortunately. Or they've like become worlds unto themselves. Have to make war on Chicago or something. But I actually think city life, like some people really like their city or localist forms. I guess I do have like residuals in my own politics around Tocquevillian, like at the associational level. Like my neighbor Mike. He's just a great person, and I don't dare broach ideology with him in case we end up disliking each other. But like Mike has kids, I've got kids. He's like, is there some way we could put a cul-de-sac? This is, LA, West LA. So like people drive too fast on our street. And we have the same problem, which is like people drive too fast on the street. And it's not outside of ideology, but it's somewhere where there's possible overlap, and it's like it's not so prefigured or hardened. And I guess I do have a bit of Tocqueville in me in that I think that one of the ways we went wrong is that associational life became very weak in the United States. Maybe we got into the non-topography of the internet. And so we stopped being confounded by like, hey, I know you're this and I'm that, but you're actually not that bad when it comes to we play softball together, or sport would be another one. Obviously, I'm not so naive as to say sport isn't ideological. It obviously gets swallowed up in there, right? Obviously. Race, class, gender, everything else. I'm not that stupid, but I do think there's a way to participate the McIntyre thing in practices that could be helpful. Like I cook with this person, we like the same restaurant, and that has been greatly diminished by the intensity of ideological polarization. We don't go to the same restaurants, we don't like the same, we hate opposite on everything, like the cities, even the sports are now different, everything. So yeah, that's a problem. But okay, one last thing. Romeo and Juliet is the uncoolest play right now for some reason. I love Romeo and Juliet, but what I take from Romeo and Juliet is like, fall in love with the wrong person. That's what I tell to my students. It's like, please fall in love with the wrong person or wrong thing and let yourself be confused by that for a while.
Last question.
Thank you so much for your wonderful talk. My question actually arises from a very close reading of your book, which I finished last night. In your talk today, you made some references to the fact, I assume, that ideology is a post-religious secular development, that ideologies arose primarily after Enlightenment, and they're much more within the secular realm that we all recognize. You, in the chapter on nationalism, which is the penultimate chapter in your book, you describe two forms of nationalism, ethnic nationalism and civic nationalism, which you elaborate on quite a bit. And I very much, liked and admired your analysis. I'm wondering, however, whether you would agree that there is a third kind of nationalism that is arising, which relates also to your point about ideology being a post-religious, secular realm development, and that is religious nationalism. If you look at, the forms of nationalism in the contemporary, in our own times, you can see the beginnings of the rise of this third kind of nationalism. We see it in the United States among the evangelical Christians. We see it in Israel. What is Israel? Who are we? Well, we are a Jewish nation. You certainly see it in the Islamic world. You see it also in India, which for decades, many of us thought of India as the most pluralistic democracy in the world. But now, who are we? Well, we are Hindus, right? That's what the Prime Minister of India is promoting today. So would you agree that you kind of left out this third variety of nationalism? And how would you reconcile that with the notion that ideology is a secular age phenomenon?
Yeah, great question. And thanks for reading that so carefully. Yeah, I mean, I tried to subsume it under ethnic nationalism, which probably won't surprise you from that chapter.
Under what nationalism?
A form of ethnic nationalism. I tried to subsume it under that. So I tried in my typology to sort of say, when religion is mobilized as a marker of state belonging, it's marked, so it always has some ethnic dimension to it. So if I just say, I'm Catholic, it's like, yeah, but where's your ethnic state? If I'm religiously deploying that, if I'm nationalistically deploying that. So I think that the religion doesn't do enough work without the ethnic component. I basically concede your point that when the book was written, I think that we hadn't had sort of like this come roaring back. Because the other thing I want to say about this is, in a way, like with all of these ideologies, I'm all in favor of disaggregation and multiplicity. So what I would never mean to say is there are two and only two kinds of nationalism. I think I tried to fudge it in the book, and you picked up on that. That's like, well, if it's a religious nationalism, it's going to do work in terms of state identification, there's going to have to be some ethnic group behind it, like Catholic, but they don't mean the Polish Catholic movement, nationalist movement, doesn't mean Mexican Catholics can come join it, you know? And so there has to be some ethnic thing doing the work as well. But I think it's a fair point and essentially should have broken out. I do think I quote Polonius in Shakespeare, where in Hamlet, where he says, he goes into this list of like possible genres of theater. And he's like, there's pastoral comical, there's pastoral romantic comical, there's pastoral. And I actually feel that way. I feel like a Polonius of ideology. And, that it gets very, very unfunny the longer you go in that way. But I actually think Polonius is onto something there, which is just that, just like theater genres, the regime of genres can get almost like numberlessly big. And that if I'd written the book today, I would have broken out and made a conceptual distinction there, in part to help people see, like, look, there are many varieties. So I sort of plead being behind the times on that. But yeah, tried to squeeze it in the ethnic nationalist case.
And on that Shakespearean note, please join me in thanking